Recording this? Yes. All right. Okay. Let's start off right off the bat with the most difficult concept. Gross primary productivity, net primary productivity, net ecosystem productivity. Right? There's that nice figure, GPP, NPP, NEP. Okay. So these are just different ways to measure productivity in an ecosystem. And remember, there was a question in here that I think is one of the most difficult ones. It was asking like, which of these represents the most CO2 in the atmosphere, and it was kind of tricky. So the way that you should think about it, I don't know, you can think about it however you want. The way I think about it is like the ecosystem is made up of there are plants in there and there are animals in there, right? There are autotrophs, the plants, there are heterotrophs, the animals. And it's kind of like the ecosystem is like taking a breath, okay? So you have all these plants in there, and when they're taking a breath, they're sucking in CO2. So this is how CO2 is being transferred from the atmosphere, okay, into the ecosystem. And that's gross primary productivity. So GPP represents the total photosynthesis that's happening. So if you have something like a rainforest, GPP is going to be very high. Okay? If you have something like the tundra or a desert, it's going to be very low because there's not a lot of photosynthesis. If you look at GPP at night, for example, it's going to be close to zero because photosynthesis is not happening, okay, to any large degree. So GPP is sort of like the plants are kind of breathing in CO2. And so the amount of organic carbon that's in the ecosystem is very large at this stage because they've just sucked all the CO2 into their bodies. All right. A lot of that CO2 they're converting into plant mass, right? The CO2 is part of their food. That's where they're making up the bulk of their bodies, right? Plants are made mostly of carbon, they're getting it from the atmosphere. But then they sort of breathe out a little bit of it because they do respiration just like we do. So they're taking in this huge breath, that's GPP, and then they're breathing out a little bit of it, that's NPP, net primary productivity. So at this point, we haven't even involved the animals. This is just plants taking in a big breath and then letting a little tiny bit of it back out. Okay, so that's NPP, and I'd say that's probably the most common measure used to measure productivity is NPP. So like when we're looking at ecosystem productivity, it's like we're not even thinking about animals yet. It's all about the plants. Okay? But sometimes we want to consider the animals too. And the animals are releasing that carbon in heterotrophic respiration, which is just our version of respiration. So now it's like the whole ecosystem's breathing out even more. So now even more CO2 is going back into the atmosphere. That's NEP, net ecosystem production. So the amount of organic carbon in the ecosystem, it starts off really big with GPP when the plants take their big breath, and then it gets smaller with NPP and even smaller with NEP. But the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is inverse to that. The plants just took a big breath, they just sucked a bunch of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So there's a little bit of CO2, and then as they're breathing back out, a little more is in the atmosphere, and then as the animals are breathing out, even more. So there was that question in there asking which one represents the most CO2 in the atmosphere, and the answer was NEP. And if you got it wrong, you probably put GPP because you were looking at the diagram and seeing this big circle saying organic carbon for GPP, but it was asking CO2. Okay? So I would definitely spend some time looking at that figure in your book. Yeah, net ecosystem production.
Explanation of it
for net ecosystem production. So that's the step where we're taking into consideration animals, and they are releasing CO2 as part of heterotrophic respiration. And that's the most challenging part of that chapter. Yes. Just animals. Plants do autotrophic respiration.
So autotrophic would be NPP and then heterotrophic would be MEP.
Correct.
Okay, so is it right here for the plant? Is the difference between NPP and heterotrophic respiration?
Mm-hmm.
So NPP is measure of the net accumulation of loss of carbon in the
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so NEP is what's left after the heterotrophs do their respiration.
Autotrophic is what?
Mm-hmm.
Respiration.
That's plant respiration. Mm-hmm. And all you need to know in terms of photosynthesis and respiration, we're not even learning the equations for it. We're definitely not learning the cellular pathways. You just need to know like which one is taking in CO2 and which one's releasing oxygen. So very basic stuff. When we did our lab on history of the earth, we talked about that as well. So that's pretty much all you need to know about photosynthesis and respiration, right? Like the plants are taking in CO2. If you cut down the plants, then they can't take in CO2 anymore. All right, pretty basic stuff on that end. Okay. All right. Let's talk about soil. All right, there are 3 particle sizes for soil. Do you know what they are? Clay is the smallest. Sand. Uh-huh. S-selected soil? Yeah, silt. Mhm. Yeah, so there's sand, silt, and clay. Which one's the biggest particle? Uh-uh.
Sand?
Sand, yeah.
Oh, 'cause it
Well, think about the beach. Like you're at the beach. I mean, that's a pretty special type of soil, but that's sand, and you can see clearly the particles. Okay, so that's the biggest particle type. And then clay. Think about you're working with like molding clay in an art class. It's really difficult, if not impossible, to see those individual particles of clay. So those are the 3 different particle sizes. Sand is the biggest, then silt, and then clay. So those are non-living things.
You said the 3
Size classes, yeah. It's got nothing to do with, what the composition of the, like elemental composition of them. It just has to do with their size.
from small to big, like sand, silt, and clay.
From-
Biggest to smallest?
Yes,
Sand,
from
silt,
biggest to
clay.
smallest, yeah. Okay, so that's the non-living part. Is soil just made of non-living things?
No, because it's like dead, decomposed matter.
Yeah.
Like
And how are things decomposing? What's decomposing it? What does the decomposition?
The decomposer?
Yeah, yeah. What are some decomposers?
Worms?
Yep, worms. What about some microscopic ones? Yeah, yeah.
Fungi.
Yeah,
Who would you say?
Fungi.
fungi.
Fungi. I was like,
Yeah,
oh.
fungi. Yeah. Bacteria. Okay. Yeah, the roly-polies that are in there. That's funny you mentioned roly-polies. We're going to mention roly-polies again in lecture on Thursday.
Really?
Yeah. So I call them potato bugs, but apparently nobody else called them potato bugs. Yeah, so you have living parts of soil, non-living parts of soil. It's a very sort of underrated and active place.
Is there an animal called maggot?
A maggot?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the larval form of a fly. Yeah.
So living parts of soil would be earthworms and roly-polies.
Yeah.
And then non-living parts of soil would be like
Sand, silt, and clay. As well as things like water, dissolved nutrients. Okay. Okay, what's the difference between, we're talking about nutrients for plants. We're still talking about like soil and soil resources. Okay, what's the difference between a macronutrient and a micronutrient?
macros, smallest? I don't know, the biggest?
I mean, macro does mean large and micro means small, but what does that mean? A macro. Yeah, but what does a macronutrient mean? It's a big nutrient, like a big.
There's like 6 nutrients.
There are 6 macronutrients. So if I told you the macronutrients for plants are nitrogen, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, and micronutrients are things like boron, iron, magnesium, molybdenum, copper.
That would be.
You don't need to know all those. Don't
Oh,
worry.
I was like, do we even know macronutrient? Because it's a sick now.
So do you think that a plant needs more nitrogen or zinc?
Nope.
Nitrogen. That's what protein is, right?
I was like, that's something
So
else.
it's kind of the same thing as us, right? Like we need lots of nitrogen, we need lots of phosphorus, calcium. You know, everyone's like, get enough calcium in your diet. No one's like, make sure you get enough molybdenum. Okay? All right, so the macronutrients are ones that plants need a lot of. Okay? So that's what means macro. In this case, macro means the plants need a lot of it. You don't need to know what the macronutrients are. You just need to know that a macronutrient is something that a plant needs a lot of. And the micronutrients, they're important, they're required, but they need them in smaller quantities. Yeah, macro versus micronutrients. Okay, and sometimes plants have a hard time getting specific nutrients. And there's a concept called the law of the minimum. What is the law of the minimum?
It's kind of dangerous, regulated by the amount of nutrients.
Yeah, there's usually like
That
one.
is less.
Yeah, there's what?
That is less. The
Yeah.
nutrient that they can find in less quantity, that's their limit.
Yes, exactly. So let's say that, you know, this plant could grow larger if only it had enough phosphorus, right? So it has everything else that it needs. It has enough nitrogen, potassium, copper, whatever else, molybdenum, all these weird little things. But if only it had enough phosphorus, it could grow larger. So you should definitely know what the common limiting nutrients are for a couple of different ecosystems, the ones that are highlighted in the book. So in the book, they talk about very broadly, 4 different ecosystems. They talk about temperate and northern latitude terrestrial environments. That's basically us, right here. Okay, and for us, it's mostly nitrogen. So if you wanted to grow a garden and you tested your soil, if it was poor in any nutrient, it's probably poor in nitrogen. So when you go to add fertilizer to it, you don't need to add fertilizer that has other potentially limiting nutrients. You just need to add nitrogen to it. Okay? What do you think happens if you add a bunch of nutrients that your plant doesn't need? What happens to those excess nutrients?
To waste, to
Yeah. It's going to wash away, it's going to get into the water. It's nutrient pollution at that point. Okay? And so there's a figure in your book that shows you nutrient limitations. It says examples of differing nutrient limitations for some of Earth's ecosystems, and you should definitely look at that.
That would be for the law of the minimum.
Yeah, like the nutrients that are most commonly limiting. The one I think is really cool is that in the open ocean, it's phosphorus and iron, and those are two elements that are found almost entirely in rocks. Like if you look, like where's all the phosphorus in the world? Where's all the iron? I mean, obviously, there's not iron like floating around in the air. Okay, it's all in rocks. So why do you think in the middle of the ocean, plants have a hard time finding phosphorus and iron?
There's no rocks.
Yeah, you're like as far away as you can possibly be from a rock. And so they've got a hard time finding those nutrients. I think that's really cool.
So any open ocean has phosphorus and
Yeah, they're limited in phosphorus and iron. In fact, if you wanted the middle of the ocean to start growing lots of plankton to, I don't know, help suck CO2 out of the atmosphere to help fix the climate change problem, you'd want to seed the ocean with phosphorus and iron fertilizer. I mean, I think that's a terrible idea, but that is an idea that is out there. Okay. All right, let's do we're almost out of time, so let's do one more concept and then we'll talk about biomes for a minute. Okay, what is mutualism?
Mutualism, it's like a bee and a flower. Where they both benefit from the same. Both benefit, like both.
They're both benefiting. Okay? What were to happen if all of a sudden the bee was benefiting and the flower was being harmed? What would it be called then? Parasitism. Okay? What if the bee was benefiting and it had no effect on the flower? Commensalism. Okay, so mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. Your book actually puts competition, sort of lumps that in there with symbioses, which is all right. It's different than how I would organize it. Mhm.
Examples of
Mhm.
was like
There could,
commensalism, it's like the whales and the varieties,
Mhm.
and then the parasitism, it's like a mosquito and like a
Mhm.
moose.
So there could be an example like a bee feeding on a flower, the bee gets food, the flower gets pollinated. This is an example of commensalism, mutualism, parasitism, competition. And you would say mutualism. Okay? Interspecific competition versus intraspecific competition.
Interspecific competition is when two of the same species are going for the same resource, and then interspecific is two different species fighting for the same food.
I think of it like an interstate highway, like I-95 is an interstate highway because it goes among multiple states. So the interstate is multiple states, interspecific competition is multiple species. Intra, yeah.
Or something. I was like,
Yeah.
if I was able to figure
Yeah,
it
as
out.
long you can think of however you want. So, okay, so biomes briefly. So, and everyone's going to now see you on the recording because I'm turning my computer. This figure with all the biomes, like the little colored circles with all the biomes, there's going to be something similar to that on the exam. So spend some time looking at it. You don't need to memorize it because the figure that looks similar to that will be on the exam. So you should be able to interpret it. Like understand that, you can look at it and see that the desert is drier than the tropical savanna. But a desert can also be warm or cold. Like you should be able to interpret what that figure looks like. And really, the questions there, it's really just testing whether or not you can interpret a figure. Okay, and if you have some knowledge about biomes, it will help you. But it really is just testing if you can interpret a figure. Okay? Okay. So the biome stuff, the hardest thing, I think, is telling them apart. Right? Because if you're like, it's a biome, there are plants and animals here, and it has soil. It can be anything. Okay? So there will be questions where it describes a biome, and you have to say what it is. Or it says something like, which of these are common threats for this biome. So look at those little tables that describe, precipitation, temperature, soil, but also reread that text so you know things about the common threats to the different biomes. Yeah, so if it asks, like, a common threat to the tundra is, and one of the options is logging, logging is not a threat to the tundra. Why not? Because there are no trees, okay? There's no trees in there, all right? Let's see, what else? Let me think of some examples. Okay, the boreal forest and the tundra both have permafrost. What's permafrost? Yeah, close. I mean, it's permanently frozen soil. So if they both have permafrost, what makes them different from each other? It shouldn't. Tundra versus boreal forest. In both of them, but they're really different. I mean, they're both cold.
They're different parts of the.
Yeah. Yeah. Where are they located? Yeah, tundra is further north. Yep, so it's colder. So shorter growing season, longer time in the dark. We just said it has no trees. What is the other one's called a boreal forest. So they have trees. Okay, all right. So like to me, it helps to like kind of look at ones that are similar and think of what makes them different. So if you're presented with a question where you have one option is a tropical grassland savanna and the other one is a tropical coniferous forest, you're like, okay, shoot, they're both tropical. We know they're both warm, but one of them's a grassland and one of them is a coniferous forest. So then you can picture what does a grassland look like? Okay, it's grasses, no trees, dominated by grazers. What does a coniferous forest look like? Think about, well, what is a conifer? What's a coniferous tree?
The one that drop grains.
Other drop of leaves and we know? It's a different one.
What's coniferous?
Grain.
It's green?
Grain.
Grain?
The
It has a
trees that
cone.
Yes.
Coniferous. Yeah, like a pine tree.
Like pine tree.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So if
Forest.
Yeah, so like a tropical coniferous forest, it's tropical, we know it's warm. It's coniferous forest, so we know it's got a bunch of pine trees. So you can sort of picture it in your head a little bit. There's also on Blackboard, I don't know if it's helpful. I made it for my students last semester because some of them were absolutely freaking out about biomes. I made like a little PowerPoint slideshow. I put it together in 5 minutes. I mean, it's literally just a picture of each biome with the name of the biome underneath. Like, don't judge me on it.
I would love that.
It is so you could just watch this little PowerPoint slideshow just to give you a visual on the different biomes. So that's up on Blackboard under lecture materials as well.
Oh, that's a new lecture?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it is not fantastic. It was literally like the students were really worried about biomes and they asked for a slideshow and I did it in 5 minutes. So I'm sure if you had time, you could put together a much nicer one for yourself. Or if you're working in a group for your group.
These are lecture materials. Which lecture was it? Do you remember? Or do you...
I think it's week 8. Week 8 is the biomes lecture. And then there's a separate one that's like biome slideshow or something, and it's just 14 slides, and each one has a picture of the biome.
Yeah,
It's extremely basic.
It's like in like this.
It's extremely basic. Okay. Do you guys have questions right now?
I'm sorry, you didn't ask like autotrophic respiration or heterotrophic respiration.
Well, what's the difference?
Autotrophic is like with the plants, and heterotrophic is like the eat food.
Autotrophs are plants, heterotrophs are animals. So we're doing heterotrophic respiration right now. What else? Where do you feel like you have the most work to do? But again, you can't neglect the biomes because it's a quarter of the exam. But don't just study biomes.
Like how would you phrase like an example like NTP?
I mean, I don't honestly, I don't remember what the question or questions on the exam look like about that. But the question that's in Pearson is a pretty good way to frame something like that.
Did you ask me like specific questions about like CO2, like DDX, like any kind of like questions about that?
I don't remember. I don't think.
That's the hard part.
I know. I don't think so. You should definitely know, photosynthesis is taking CO2 out and respiration is putting it back in.
There was like a few like where I was just reading about like how that works, and the whole time I was just like, I'm kind of lost, but it's pretty specific. So
I don't think there's anything beyond just photosynthesis respiration. Review it. I don't like have the whole exam in my head. I don't think that there is though.
So it was like multiple paragraphs explaining different concepts. So I was like, I can probably write this down.
I agree, and I think that I think it's kind of a weaker section as well. Yeah.
That's way better than I. And then like the examples when you have like